Welcome. I'm Pete Howard from the Digital Business Institute here at Boston University's Questrom School of Business. I'm pleased to be joined today by Professor Garrett Johnson, Assistant Professor of Marketing, researcher, and a frequent speaker on digital advertising, privacy, and advertising effectiveness. Professor Johnson works with big companies, including Google and Yahoo, to answer tough questions with internet-scale data. He examines online advertising's effectiveness and privacy issues using large-scale experiments to measure how and how much ads work, and quantifies the value of behavioral targeting in the industry and the impact of policy and self-regulatory approaches. Professor Johnson has been awarded the Paul Green Award and has been a finalist for both the John D.C. Little Award and the Gary Lillen Marketing Sciences Practice Prize. And he's also been a member of the Web Standards Association, W3C, business group discussing post-cookie privacy since 2020. So we definitely have the right expert today for our topic. So welcome, Professor Johnson.
Well, thank you very much.
Today we're talking about privacy issues in digital marketing, specifically what we call cookies. The death of the cookie has long been rumored in the marketing industry. So Professor, what's going on and why is it important?
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Pete. Happy to talk about this subject that is really taking off over the last year or so and means some big changes on the horizon. So let's start off just by very simply asking what browser cookies are and what they do. So when you visit your favorite website, so here I've got The Guardian, which is a newspaper in the UK, your web browser is going to be interacting with the domain of The Guardian, which is theguardian.com. And The Guardian wants to know who you are, and they want to be able to recognize you. For instance, if you're a subscriber, it wants you to be able to see all the content. And in order to do so, it uses just a small text file called a cookie. And that small text file is going to have a synonymous identifier. Here it's ABC123. That allow the Guardian to remember who you are when you come back to the website. The Guardian is also going to work with a lot of vendors to help make its website work and to monetize itself with ads. And so if the Guardian chooses to work with Google for its advertising, then the Guardian's website would tell your browser to interact with a domain owned by Google called doubleclick.net. And doubleclick.net is then going to put a cookie on your browser as well. And you'll note that the user ID, EFG456, is different than the first party ID for the Guardian. And there's a couple reasons for that. First, doubleclick.net can actually read the cookies that the Guardian has on your computer. So it doesn't have a way of measuring that directly. But also, Google may have already put a third-party cookie on your browser on another website. So for instance, if you visited Macy's.com previously and Macy's decided to try to show you ads on another website, then doubleclick.net could have put a third-party cookie on your browser when you visited Macy's so that Google can recognize you when you go to The Guardian and show you ads for Macy's. So cookies kind of make the internet a friendly place that remembers who you are. So here's a little Cheers reference, seeing as we're shooting this from Boston. And so this is a very, very useful thing. And it's particularly useful for advertising. So in advertising, we've got publishers that are websites trying to sell ad space. We've got advertisers on the other side of the market trying to buy these ad opportunities. And the data that's being shared in this marketplace is some metric of some identifier for who you are, which is typically stored on a third-party cookie, and some context about the ad itself, like the URL or the link that the ad is going to be showing on. So that's the status quo. And I've given you an example of how Google can be in the background connecting your session on The Guardian to a third-party cookie. But The Guardian actually is going to work with a lot of different companies. Here visualized using this extension for Chrome called Disconnect. So you can see a lot of different companies in this space, some logos you may recognize. Not all of them are going to be using third-party cookies, but typically the ones for advertising purposes will be using third-party cookies. So if we're losing cookies, who cares? What is the actual value of this? Well, advertisers value this a lot because it allows them to have a cross-site identifier for the purposes of advertising. And this is very useful to advertisers. It's going to power 3 key value generators. The first is targeting. So this allows advertisers to have a sense of your interests and to retarget you. For instance, if you've visited an advertiser like Macy's, it allows Macy's to target you on other websites. And also very simply is useful for managing the number of ads you've seen so that you don't get spammed with too many ads, and for advertisers knowing the number of people that have seen their ads. The second thing is measurement. And this is important because the public discussion is really focused on targeting. And I've been guilty of this too, and it's ignored the importance of measurement. So what's really transformed digital marketing relative to traditional marketing is that we can have some sense of who sees an ad and then subsequently purchases or takes some action with the advertiser. And this allows us to try to attribute credit across advertising when a consumer actually makes a purchase. So when you put those things together with the ability to buy advertising in real time using computers, you can automate this at scale, you can optimize your campaigns, and you can redeploy your campaigns based on this information you have about how well your campaigns are doing. So, that's the benefit for advertisers, but what about the benefit for us? Well, the benefit for us is, I guess, twofold. Once we get better targeted advertising, but I think the more interesting thing is that if websites have cookies for users, they can increase their ad revenue by something like 2 or 3x. And that matters to us because we typically don't pay for the services and content that we enjoy on the web. And so it's effectively being paid for by this advertising that gets higher prices. So how do we know this? So myself and others, both in industry and in academia, have researched this subject and asked the question, how much do ad prices fall without cookies? And most of us agree that the ad prices fall by something between 50 and 70%. So this is matters and it's going away. So what does advertising look like without cookies? Well, the first big domino to fall in the background here was a privacy regulation in Europe called the GDPR. And that, I think, really put privacy at center. And I think consumers are potentially becoming even more interested in privacy as time goes on. And in response to these changes, 2 browsers have already blocked third-party cookies. So Safari has been blocking this for a few years. Firefox followed not too long after. And then Google, which owns the largest browser, which is Chrome, has decided that they're not going to support third-party cookies after the end of 2023. So the days of cookies really appear to be numbered. And so what's going to take their place? So I envision in the future that there's kind of 4 main tent poles of advertising post-cookies. The first is context, and then sign-in, the walled gardens, and Privacy Sandbox. So what's context? Basically, if we know nothing about you on a website, we at least know something about the website that you're on. So if you are on a finance website, then the good news is there's a lot of advertisers that would probably want to show an ad, like E-Trade, for instance. This is bad news, however, if you're visiting a website that's trying to inform you about the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, because Afghanistani tourism is at an all-time low right now. So this obviously matters for more general content and more news content. So it's not a solution for everybody. The second thing is sign-in. And probably some of you have already had this experience when you're browsing the internet. Increasingly, websites are asking you to log in. And the reason for this is that if we get rid of third-party cookies, then there's still these strong economic incentives to know who you are across websites. And so if you log into a website where you see advertising, and then you log into an e-commerce site where you purchase something, then that email identifier or something like it can be pseudonymized and linked in order to make that connection that cookies used to make. The problem there, though, is that not all websites can ask you to sign in or will get you to sign in. Not everyone is going to sign in, and not everyone is going to use their same email or equivalent across different websites. And so you may be missing the full picture. So what are the walled gardens? In advertising, these are largely Google and Facebook and Amazon. So these big giant companies that make up a huge portion of the spend when it comes to advertising on the internet. So Google and Facebook alone are something like 56% of total ad spend. And if you get rid of cross-site tracking, then this actually hurts them as well. But I think the expression "in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king" really applies here. They still have the size and the pull with the advertisers and just the number of users and activities that they monitor on their own channels, such that it puts them at a real big advantage relative to some of the more niche websites that we visit as part of our daily lives. And then the last tentpole is Privacy Sandbox. And this is basically a collection of technology proposals to replace the cookie. And this is where I want to spend the rest of our time to try to understand what these things consist of. Before we go there, though, I think it's useful to kind of take a step back and ask ourselves the question, how can privacy and modern advertising coexist? Because it sure seems like, there's a lot of snooping that's going on in the background. And this seems like a hard thing to make work. So let me start with the good news. So the good news, both from a privacy perspective and from an advertiser perspective, is that advertisers do not care about just like an audience of one. It's just, even with the miracle of digital advertising, making it so easy to advertise to users, even then it doesn't pay to go after a user of one. And so advertisers want to reach audiences. They want to reach large collections of consumers, ideally targeted towards the interests of those consumers. So here at this juncture, we're in a world that I think is a pretty good way to have both privacy and meet the needs of advertisers. But advertisers have a very long wish list for what they want to accomplish. So a very basic thing is that advertisers want to measure clicks, for instance, to see what ads appear to be performing better. Advertisers also want to measure conversions. They want to understand who sees an ad and then subsequently buys things. That's kind of one of the most important things that they can understand about the effectiveness of their advertising. Advertisers also care about recent information. If you are showing interest for to paint a room 2 months ago, that's probably not that interesting to most advertisers. But if you have been looking for paint in the last 15 minutes or 2 hours, then probably Home Depot and Lowe's and Ace Hardware are going to be really excited to show you an ad and try to convince you to buy paint from them. Advertisers also want to know the number of ads that people are seeing. And this is useful, I think, both to consumers and to advertisers, because the advertisers would probably rather show the next ad to a user that's seen fewer ads than a user that's seen too many ads already. Finally, and I'm a big believer in this, advertisers should or do want to run experiments where they compare users in a treatment group that see their ads to users in a control group that don't see their ads, to see what is the actual increase in sales that I'm generating as a result of my advertising. So you can see, as this picture has become progressively more complex, that identity, that is knowing who you are as you view ads and as you take actions related to those ads, this is a very elegant solution. It's a solution that solves every one of these use cases. And so if we want to try to solve these use cases without identity, this is going to create some challenges. And certainly one of the main challenges is complexity, as we're going to see as we move forward here. But broadly speaking, privacy is in tension with a few things. It's in tension with the ability for advertisers to measure and target their advertising. That's something they enjoy to a great extent in the current environment. So increasing privacy is probably going to cause some sacrifice there. There's also a tension with competition. So it's easier for large firms to keep up with these changes. It's easier for large firms to get insights from large data sets, especially when we use, in order to protect privacy, we start to make changes to those data sets. And then the broad solutions to these problems involve either a lot of decentralization or centralization. So decentralization means that all the information stays on your device, like your mobile phone, and doesn't get ported to the rest of the world in order to protect your privacy. Or all of the information gets centralized in some black box that restricts how industry can interact with that black box in ways that allow the targeted advertising to be delivered and measured, but still protect your privacy. So now that the table is set, let me tell you about some proposals to make this work. So I like to refer to these proposals as the birds because they have very long acronyms, and those acronyms have been cleverly chosen to have bird names like sparrow and fledge and parrot and petrel. So I think it's helpful to start with a definition. So the Privacy Sandbox, there's potentially many companies that have contributed proposals to this. Today, I'm going to focus on the ones that have been proposed by Google and their Chrome team. So the Chrome's Privacy Sandbox consists of multiple proposals that aim to preserve many of the benefits of cross-site identity in programmatic advertising while offering superior privacy protection to the user. Now, I want to linger on this and unpack this a little bit because I think it further sets the table for what's happening. So first of all, multiple. So cookies were kind of solving many use cases, but the sandbox proposes multiple replacement technologies that deliver on these advertiser use cases, including targeting, measurement, frequency management, and fraud prevention. So it kind of unbundles this into a whole bunch of different technologies. The second thing you'll note is that these are proposals. And so these are proposed technical specifications that give you some sense of how these replacement technologies are going to work. But many important details are still being refined. And this adds to our uncertainty about just what the future holds for digital advertising. Third, I think it's worthwhile to remind ourselves of the benefits of cross-site identity. For advertisers, this means that you get more effective ads. For publishers, that means that they get more revenue, so they can hire more reporters, for instance. And for users, this means that we get to enjoy more free content and more relevant ads. Now, finally, we have privacy protection. And here, you'll note that the definition of privacy protection is quite narrow. It's in the narrow sense that users' cross-site browsing on the open web is going to be difficult or impossible to attribute to an individual users. But ads can still be targeted based on the sites that you're browsing. So in some sense, the advertising you see might not change that much. And also, the largest websites like YouTube and Google are still going to have a lot of first-party data or data that they directly observe about you. And so the largest companies are probably going to be advantaged. So let me walk you through very quickly 6 of the proposals within Google's Privacy Sandbox. And then I'm going to do a little bit more about Flock and Fletch, the first 2. So one of the things that we want to do is we still want to have targeted advertising. And if you've heard of one proposal within the Privacy Sandbox, it's probably Flock. In fact, you may have heard of Flock and not even heard of the Privacy Sandbox. And the idea of Flock is that we put users into a cohort of people that seem to share similar preferences. And we infer those preferences based on the websites that you browse. And the idea is that if you are in a cohort with thousands of other people, then there's some safety in the crowd. So the other websites are learning something about you, but that something is shared with thousands of other people. The second proposal, Fletch, allows for retargeting and behavioral targeting, but it is a really ambitious proposal that re-architects the entire way that online advertising is being purchased. And it basically does this by putting the user's device in control of how advertising works. So I'll come back to that one because I think it's a really rich and interesting proposal. Third, we have two measurement APIs that would allow advertisers to see the number of people that had been exposed to their campaigns and to see the number of clicks and the number of click-through conversions from these people. And currently, advertisers basically get to see this data in real time. But that real-time data flow can be very indicative of who a user is. And so what this does is this aggregates all of these events and reports them with some delay. So we don't get to find out when people click as they click it. We get to find out after a day or after a week the total number of people that have clicked and converted, possibly with some noise or reporting thresholds to further protect consumer privacy. So moving more quickly now, so first-party sets, that's allowing websites that are jointly owned, so think youtube.com and google.com, to know who you are across these websites. This next proposal, privacy budget and NAT catcher. One challenge in this space is that if we get rid of cookies tomorrow, advertisers and ad tech companies have other ways of figuring out who you are. And one very powerful strategy is to use your IP address. Now, websites and third-party companies need to know your IP address to be able to send stuff to your browser. And that IP address can be very valuable information that can, in some cases, uniquely identify users, or in other cases, pretty closely uniquely identify users. And so what these proposals try to do is to try to restrict the information that's going to these third-party companies and to your browser. And this is a challenging thing because you have to kind of obscure the IP address and reroute things in the background to make that work. And finally, one very important use case for identity is to identify fraud. And fraud is a really serious problem. So I mean ad fraud, like robots eating up ad budgets. This is a really serious problem in digital advertising. And so the proposal here is called trust tokens. And the big idea is that a large company, a large website, so maybe Facebook, for instance, Facebooks could vouch for users. So they could vouch for Pete, for instance, and say that Pete is a real person and not a bot, so that when Pete browsed the internet on other websites, these trust tokens can be used to give advertisers some sense that their money is going to be well spent when they advertise to Pete. Okay. So let me talk about two of these proposals in a little bit more detail. The first being Flock. And we've already seen that when advertising is being bought and sold, that the data that's shared is some user identifier, usually stored on a third-party cookie, as well as some context like the URL that the ad will appear on. So what flocks do is they assign users to a cohort, so a group of people, and they assign users that have similar browsing histories to the same cohort. So every week, a user is going to be assigned to a single cohort, and at least the first version of Flock had lots and lots of cohorts, like 33,000 possible cohorts. And in order to be assigned to one of these cohorts, you have to visit at least 7 sites to give some signal to this algorithm. Now, in order to protect your privacy in some sense, we're going to make sure that these cohorts have a minimum size so that you're sharing this attribute with thousands of different users. So in that sense, you are hidden in the crowd. So let me walk you through an example of how this works and how this looks like. So suppose in the first week, I'm visiting a bunch of websites like cbc.ca and oilersnation.com and oilers.nhl.com. These are all kind of hockey and Canada related websites. And based on this, the algorithm assigns me to the flock ID ABC123. Now that in itself is not actually very informative, right? ABC123, we don't really know what that means. But presumably, if we were able to look at a lot of flock IDs across a lot of websites, we would start to get some at least rough sense of what these IDs mean. So we could label this in this example as Canadian hockey fans. Now, in this second week, I go to websites like Twitter and CNN and Ad Exchanger and Ad Monsters and Digiday and U of Digital. These are all kind of, or most of these are ad tech related websites. And so in the second case, I get assigned to the flock ID EFG456. And so if we were to come up with an informative label for this, it would say that we are ad tech news junkies. So in this way, we're able to unbundle this large collection of users that are arriving at a websites into cohorts based on their interests. So what does this look like? Well, the beauty of this proposal in some sense is that you can essentially maintain the way that the status quo works. You're getting rid of a third-party cookie identifier and replacing it with a flock ID. And you may still have some identifier like a first-party cookie, which allows an advertiser to know the number of ad times they've shown you an ad on a particular website. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack here about the advantages and disadvantages and decisions that go into this, but I'll kick that to the Q&A because I do want to talk about the second proposal called Fletch. So in Fletch, users are classified into interest groups based on the sites that they browse. And at that level, it sounds a lot like Flock, but the key difference is that an individual website can choose to assign you to an interest group when you're browsing that website. So how do we protect user privacy here? Well, the interest groups that you belong to are never going to leave your browser. And so nobody else is going to learn about that. But the status quo requires that the ad sale and the ad marketplace basically happens outside of your browser. So in order to make these two things work, we're going to have the browser run the auction that selects a targeted ad based on the interest groups that a user belongs to. So this original proposal was called Turtle Dove, and Fledge is basically the initial implementation of this that has a lot of privacy preserving elements, but not all of them, like fence frames and trusted service, which I'll tell you about in a couple slides. So certainly a popular use case in advertising, maybe less so for users, is retargeting. So if you go to Macy's and you see a great product like a Darth Vader one-piece pajama suit, and you add this to your cart, but don't actually complete the purchase, then Macy's is probably going to want to show ads to you because they believe that if they remind you about this product in your cart, that you'll go back and purchase. And so when you're visiting Macy's, Macy's can make the decision to add you to the Macy's retargeting interest group. But this is actually pretty broadly useful. So a few weeks ago, we installed a Murphy bed, which is a bed that stores vertically. And I was trying to do research as to what kind of mattresses are safe to store in that way. And so I visited this website called Best Mattress Brand, where I did some research. And you might imagine that people on this website are really valuable to mattress companies. And so this website, Best Mattress Brand, could create an interest group of people that appear to be in the market for purchasing a mattress. And advertisers could compete for the opportunity to get access to that interest group in order to show ads, which is kind of like affiliate marketing for those that know that term. Okay, so now we've got this browser that's wandering the internet and that belongs to several interest groups. So the Macy's group and the interested in buying mattresses group, for instance. And the browser could know some other things about us, like they could know the number of times that Macy's had previously shown us an ad. And they could combine that information to run an auction to decide which targeted ad people see. Now, especially those of you that are familiar with advertising, one thing that's a little weird here is that usually it's the publisher that's deciding how this auction works. And actually, that's going to be retained in the sense that the seller, meaning the website, is going to tell that auction some things like the advertisers that are eligible to bid in that auction, the sort of bids that they're going to accept, and the rules of that auction. So the publisher or the seller still has an important role. And as for the buyer, well, the buyer already expressed interest in you when they created this interest group. But at the same time, they actually went a little further and specified their bidding strategy, like their willingness to pay for those users, as well as the ad creative or ad copy that they want to show users with the interest groups. Now, especially if you're an advertiser, you may look at this and think, hold on, if I'm pre-specifying my bids and I've got all these people wandering around on these websites and creating ad impressions for me, what happens if I've run out of budget for my ad budget for the month? I wouldn't want all these kind of zombie campaigns and zombie users eating up all my budget. So in order to make that work, we have a third party that comes in, which is some server, which we hope is a trusted server that's a black box that will protect user privacy. And then the buyer can load some elements of its bidding strategy that are changing in real time, like for instance, the amount of budget that it has left. And then the trusted server can interact with the on-device auction. And so, for instance, they could cancel the bid if the advertiser's budget has run out. So when you put in all this architecture together, you're able to get a targeted ad. And even here, life becomes a little bit more complicated because say this is a Washington Post website and the user is now seeing an ad for Macy's. Well, if the Washington Post sees this, then they know that the user's been to Macy's. And if Macy's sees this, they know that the user has been to Washington Post. And that kind of defeats the whole purpose of privacy protective advertising, not knowing who we are across websites. So the final piece here would be for this ad to render in a kind of firewall that does not send signals to the seller or to the buyer, at least on an individual basis. And that firewall is called a fence frame. So I'm sure those of you in the audience here that are gripping your sandwiches a little tighter are certainly seeing that this is a very complex way of doing things. And the status quo is also very complex, but this requires essentially a re-architecting of how advertising is bought and sold. One that provides a lot of benefits, but it certainly adds some complexity. So this is hard. And in part in response to these challenges that are on the horizon, myself and my co-authors, Julian and Eric, wrote a short paper, and by short, I mean 7 pages, talking about the implications that this has for advertisers and how researchers and practitioners should think about this. So I encourage you to check this out. I actually put a link already in the chat to this web page that hosts the paper. So to briefly overview what we talk about, we basically say that this is going to change how advertisers do their work. So they're going to have to reevaluate their ad strategy, their targeting, as well as their measurement. So let me walk through just a few of these things at high level, especially for the advertisers in the room. So if you are a digital advertiser today, you're pretty spoiled in that your strategy can be one of continuous decision making. You can constantly be adjusting dials. You can have thousands of creative variations, and you can optimize all that in real time. Now, these privacy-centric changes are actually going to push you back to a more discrete strategic mindset. And some of this is just by construction. So privacy-centric advertising is going to restrict the number and minimum size of your creatives and your campaigns and your measurement cohorts. And so you're not going to be able to have thousands of creative variations. You're going to have to focus on a small number of these creatives. And some of that's good. It would create some renewed emphasis for ad creatives. We've also grown used to being able to get very rich data about how consumers convert after seeing an ad. So we can know exactly that a user purchased a $11.99 pair of Red Sox. In privacy-centric advertising, it's going to restrict the type of conversion data that's recorded to discrete types, no longer continuous types. And by discrete types, I mean like 8 in some cases. And so one task for advertisers is to categorize their conversion events by the customer lifetime value that they associate with that. Finally, advertisers have been used to managing the number of ads that people see across websites. They're going to lose that ability. They're going to have to do that on a site-by-site basis and trade this off with maybe showing people too many ads and some of the efficiencies they can see by buying across websites. Now, as for targeting, targeting I think is really exciting. I'm glad we could talk a bit about Flock and Fledge. So Flock, I'd say the big use here is for prospecting for users, as well as for training ad optimization models. Fledge preserves much of the status quo in terms of targeting, so that's, I think, very exciting. And one of the things that I actually really like about these proposals is that they have the promise of increasing transparency and quality of the behavioral ad segments that advertisers work with, because at least in the status quo, some of these data signals can be of quite questionable quality. So lastly, how should advertisers update and combine their ad measurement methodologies? Well, in advertising, we've gotten used to user level data to be able to do cross-channel attribution modeling to understand, whether Facebook or search or display ads deserve the credit for a purchase. Now, that data is going to basically disappear for the most part. So what are advertisers left with? Well, they're left with macro data that they aggregate by time, by market, and by channel. And here they can use media mix modeling to try to measure the effects of advertising. Now, I'm a big fan of experiments. I'm really not a fan of media mix modeling, but there is some hope to try to make good use of combining these things. So to combine this with ad experiments to make sure that these models are giving us useful answers. And I keep coming back to these economic forces that push towards identity. One way that may materialize is you may get panels of consenting users where advertisers can still do user level cross-channel attribution modeling. So that's some of the things we talk about in this paper. So I guess to summarize here, I'm currently teaching digital marketing analytics to undergrads and MBAs. And I keep referring to this looming asteroid in the background that's coming towards planet digital marketing. And today I focused on planet Google, but the asteroid's actually already hit planet Apple, and the industry is kind of reeling from the consequences of that. So I wouldn't say that this is all bleak. It is to say that these are some pretty seismic challenges and changes that are coming on the horizon. I also think that it's exciting because I think that there's a lot of exciting benefits about modern digital advertising. And I also think that there's some pretty worrisome privacy consequences. And so the hope is that we can combine these things and have our cake and eat it too, have the best of both worlds. But in any case, I'm sure that by now you have lots of questions about the copious things I've talked about. So let's push to the Q&A.
Wow, Garrett, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for informative and thorough overview of what's going on out there. We're going to
take a lot.
Yes. So we'll take some questions, but as we're getting a few questions coming into the Q&A box, I'd like to start with one. So a lot of what's been said about Flux and Fledge specifically, but of the other solutions are that, yes, it's kind of clustering, but I mean, ultimately, couldn't you create clusters that are so small that they aren't really private? For example, how many people are going to buy Darth Vader pajama suits in your cluster? And will that ultimately be kind of targetable, especially if it's in, same zip code, same household even? What defines a cluster that is preservative of privacy?
Yeah, it's definitely challenging. The proposal tries to think about some of these things, so it creates some minimum threshold for the number of people within a cohort, which is in the thousands. I think they've talked about like 2,000 to 4,000.
Okay.
So that helps a little bit, but it's a big kind of sea change in how this thing works, right? Because now we're walking around the internet, and each firm has got like a pseudonymous identifier connected to us that doesn't really have a lot of other information connected to us. But the flock proposal means that we're walking around the internet with something on our forehead that says ABC123. And that's a little bit worrisome to some privacy advocates, because they worry that people could be treated differently based on that information. And certainly if we can kind of see which segments you belong to across time, this can be another tool that advertisers can use in sneaky ways to try and re-identify who you are. So those are some of the challenges, I think, with the flock proposal.
Got it. Great. Thanks. Here's a question from our participant. Great deal of advertising is directed to the mobile world. Right? Apple, according to this person's understanding, is not allowed cookies. Recently have gone into opt-out location tracking. Similar dynamics are happening in Android. But it seems unlikely that Apple's researching ways Safari can work around loss of location tracking. So basically the question is, what's next in mobile?
Yeah, it's a good question, because we've, as I said, focused on desktop advertising and Google's approach to things. So Apple, I mean, we did say that Apple has long since banned third-party tracking essentially on Safari. So they've been long taking a privacy perspective. And recently, they've started to turn that perspective on some of their own products. So iPhones now are quite aggressively asking users for consent for this ad tech stuff to work. So here it's not a cookie identifier that's being shared, but it's another big long number. In this case, it's a device ID called the IDFA. And in about April, May of this year, Apple had this policy change where they said that if advertisers and companies want to make use of those identifiers, they're going to have to get user consent. And the question that's being posed to users is in a little bit of a spooky way, telling them that this is basically tracking. So this has caused the consent rates to really fall through the floor. So I think consent rates that I've seen are on the order of about 15%. And this creates some privacy benefit for consumers. It also creates some pretty serious harms to how mobile advertising works. And this has caused, you may have seen some recent news of companies like Facebook and Snap reporting reductions in their earnings on the order of 15% because of this change. So happy to talk a bit more about that, but these changes are really happening in mobile already. I'll also say that one of the reasons I think it's interesting to talk about Privacy Sandbox is that I think Google has taken a different tact where they say, well, these cookies, they may be problematic from a privacy perspective, but they basically pay for the internet. And so we're going to create a whole bunch of different solutions to allow these benefits to still happen while protecting user privacy. And Apple's kind of taken the opposite tack where they want to protect user privacy first and then start to develop technologies. And so the technology proposals that they have are quite rudimentary. And so that's been also a big headache to people in the mobile space, is trying to work with these rudimentary tools like SK Ad Network. Great.
Thank you for that. Here's another question that I love this question. You and I have discussed this, and I certainly look at some of the research that says, essentially the question is, do people really care about cookies going away? Why are they going away? Some research indicates that Gen Z, 87% like personalized ads, and they like being targeted specifically to their interests and uses. Now, some people take the 13% and say, 13% don't like it, but generally, it's accepted by people. So the specific question here is, third-party cookies are only a problem if they're used to break laws. What laws are being broken by the use of third-party cookies that require the removal? And what are the remedies were even considered?
That's an interesting question and lots to unpack there. So the first thing is just, where are consumers in this? And it's part of my research that looked into this. We tried to understand things from a consumer perspective. And one bedeviling problem in the privacy space is what's called the privacy paradox. And the privacy paradox basically means that people tend to say that they value their privacy a lot, but they don't tend to take many actions that preserve their privacy. Not to say they don't do any actions, but typically they don't follow through. So in our own research, we noted the fact that when you ask people how they feel about targeted advertising or behavioral advertising, most surveys find that 2/3 of people say they don't like this. But when we looked at data to see how many consumers opt out of this, the fraction was minuscule. It was like 0.26% of ads. Now, it could be that this system is just not very broadly understood by consumers, but we also didn't see a lot of search volume for internet privacy, and we didn't see a lot of interest by using privacy protective browser extensions, for instance. So this is a challenge, especially for businesses, because businesses ultimately make money based on what you do and not on what you say. So this is a really hard problem for regulators too, because they need to understand, should we really protect what people say in terms of their privacy or what they do as well. So, one of the questions was basically, how does this filter into the law? So in Europe, they have this policy called the GDPR, and European regulators say that in order to use this personal data, because Europe considers these pseudonymous identifiers to be your personal data, that you need to get consent. And so websites are supposed to get pretty rigorous opt-in consent. And that is a hard thing for websites to get, especially if they really follow the letter of the law of the GDPR. And so I think part of the genesis of all this is that looking forwards and seeing the mounting frustration in Europe with this way of doing advertising, the writing's kind of on the wall there for needing to make a change. Now, it's one question is, should the rest of the world go the way of Europe? We seem to be heading in that direction. Does that answer? That was kind of a multi-part question. I hope that
it was
enough of a multi-part answer.
An accurate multi-part answer. So there are laws in Europe that have been enacted in California now as well, and certainly there is a regulatory environment that's approaching this. And sounds like addressing it is a challenge, but the question is, how many people really are being impacted? Here's a great one for you. So people coming into digital marketing now, new entries, graduates coming into digital marketing as a career, are there going to be different skills to learn? And what's going to happen to these careers as they're coming in with current training?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I added a section to my class, or another class session, talking about all these privacy changes that are happening. And I feel like it's not enough. It's a challenging thing as an educator, because you want to prepare people as much as possible for the future. But we're still not exactly sure what shape the future is going to take. So it could be, for instance, that maybe Fletch is what goes forward and Flock dies, or maybe Flock lives within Fletch in ways that protect consumers' privacy. So with that level of uncertainty, you try to teach a broad set of skills, and certainly try to do that here at Questrom. But yeah, I think it is a challenge for people in this space. I think it's always been a challenge, because the pace of development and of change and of analytics is really quite aggressive. But here you saw in my presentation that there is even yet another level of complexity that's coming our way. And some of these privacy preserving algorithms that obfuscate data or aggregate data, or go into these black boxes to protect privacy. I guess in some level, not everybody needs to understand these things. They need to be able to work with them. But I think to lead in the marketplace, if you're a company in this space, you really do need to dive headfirst into this stuff.
Maybe it's just that, as I've heard you say, you just need to be current, and it's constant learning. As a marketer, you never stop learning, right? Things change rapidly in our environment, so this will be one change, right?
Yeah, for sure. Because I have done research in this space and I've been involved in the W3C talking about this stuff, I try to get, daily advertising news and only look at the stuff to do with identity. And I still feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose. Like it is, really a lot. And, it's a lot of work that I do on top of my research to really stay up on this stuff.
On an optimistic note, here's another question, kind of related. So is it still worth doing programmatic marketing? Essentially, I'm paraphrasing the question, Sam, but with all these complexities, is it still worth it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And also, I just want to thank everybody for being so engaged and bringing a lot of questions.
Yeah, great questions.
Yeah, so again, I guess there's two parts of it. One, I think programmatic, I think, has a lot of value. I think the ability to plug into a steady stream of revenue that varies with the market conditions, that allows advertisers to be very nimble, that has just so much appeal. And that's why the share of programmatic advertising, or advertising that's traded via computers rather than via person-to-person negotiation, that's now like 85% of digital banner advertising. So I think those efficiencies are very powerful, and hopefully we will see many of these efficiencies being retained. I think the other way to take that question is to sort of look at, if we go back to some of these more complicated pictures like this thing, kind of scratching our head and thinking, is all of this re-architecting, is that, what is the social value of that? And it's an interesting question because, it is a really big social investment that we're making, and one that, probably at best kind of recovers the benefits of the status quo. Maybe in some ways will be superior, but probably in others will be not as good. And so, a question that we should ask as a society is, do we value privacy enough that it's worth making this big investment to basically, run in place? And, there's maybe good reasons to think that, even if I would say that there's not a very frequent and terrible privacy problems in the current system, at least in the sense that like information gets leaked and, we end up being blackmailed with this sort of thing. This is not what this data is being used for. But in practice, you sort of moving forward, you worry that with all this information lying around, you could hear more and more of these stories. So that would be a good reason to make these kind of investments. I hope that helps.
Fantastic. Slightly different question that's interesting. Does blockchain have a role here in terms of privacy preservation? Is there some talk of leveraging blockchain technologies to kind of execute the tracking without having privacy concerns?
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's kind of some things that point in that direction, and other things that point in the opposite direction. So I guess one browser in this space called Brave has really staked a position about being very focused on privacy and very focused on reducing the ads that people see, but still using the ads that they do see to create some money and share that money with consumers and with websites, at least in principle. And what underpins that financial transaction is a cryptocurrency called I think it's the Brave Attention Token, BAT. So that shows some promise there. I guess what's moving away from this is that I think cryptocurrency can be good for automating transactions and maybe reducing fraud by being able to kind of have a algorithmic paper trail for these things. The challenge is that these cryptocurrencies typically struggle with like very frequent small transactions. Like there's a lot of work that goes on in the background with these cryptocurrencies to aggregate these transactions to try to minimize these costs. And so here in advertising, you're seeing like billions of transactions per day per platform. And those transactions have an average value of like a fraction of a penny. So those kind of forces, I think, move against using a cryptocurrency. But I know there's some startups in this space that think that it can be useful for protecting participants in the industry. So there's kind of more to it than that.
So as a final question, is kind of give you a chance to have the last word and wrap. We have a question that prompted me to look at a quote that I have from you. You recently quoted as saying, where we land in this whole issue of replacement systems really depends on the quality of the replacement for cookies. This is your quote, I also worry that the pie will be divided more unequally because the walled gardens will be able to preserve many of their current advantages. Walled gardens will thus be even tougher competition for the open web. And the question had to do with Apple and Google just getting more domination and media control. So tell us more about that. What's the future look like? Is it a monopolistic or duopoly situation?
Yeah, it is a challenge. Certainly that is a challenge with the status quo. And I worry that any changes that happen on a third-party basis, they make it harder for small apps and small sites to compete with the big ones. So I certainly worry about that as an issue. And that's another, going to these hard trade-offs here. If we want privacy, then that's seems to be a trade-off that is pretty hard to escape. I'm hopeful that if you create robust technology solutions that replace the cookie, then this creates an even playing field that many participants can play in and still create value and still share an important piece of the pie. But certainly that is a concern that we should all share with this as well.
Well, Garrett, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and insights and research with the group today. It's been fantastic. Any final words before we shut off?
Oh, I just want to thank everybody for taking their lunchtime or afternoon to think about these things. It can feel a little bit overwhelming, but I think the changes on the horizon are also, exciting to potentially have our cake and eat it too. So thanks again for taking part and being interested in what's going on here at Questrom.
I want to thank the audience for participating in the Insights Questrom, the Digital Business Institute webinar series. Look for more content coming from us soon, and thanks very much and have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody that came too.